I've worked at a locally owned liquor store for quite a while. In fact, I'm almost at a decade working there. I started back when I was 21, and I'm about to be 30. If there's something I can tell you about working at a liquor store, they are crazy people magnets, and those crazy people like to come out at night. When they come out, they crave alcohol, and the only thing standing between them and what they want is at that point me. So that said, I could probably fill out an entire novel with the weird people I've encountered and the crazy situations I've been in. However, just for the sake of brevity, I'll just talk about one customer in particular. He was a decent guy. There was just one instance that genuinely freaked me out. A bit of backstory to how he came to be a customer. About 2 years into my working there, the store actually changed its hours to be open later because the state or county, not sure which, had approved extended hours for liquor stores. Because of this, we went from closing at 9 p.m. to closing at midnight. I was cool with working the late shifts, so I got put on the closing, and for the most part, everything was okay. That was until the new hours attracted a very particular man. We're going to call this man Daryl. Daryl was a very strange guy that was very, very open about the things in his life to people that he barely knew. The first night that he came in, he grabbed a large handle off the shelf, came up to the register, and looked me dead in the eyes. And when I say dead in the eyes, I mean that he seriously looked dead, and he stared at me with a seriously cold and aggressive glare. I was taught from a young age that you should be nice to people you don't know, because you never know what they're going through. So I looked at him back and asked how he was doing on that fine evening. As soon as I said that, he said back in practically a whisper, "Don't talk." After about 10 or 20 agonizingly silent and awkward seconds, he smiled and said something to the effect of, "All right, you're pure." At first I thought his "don't talk" statement was the start of a robbery, like he was about to pull a gun or something, but then he gave me this half-toothless grin, and it kind of put my mind at ease. I rang him up and we moved on. Then the next time he came in, I asked what the whole "you're pure" thing was about. He smiled at me and said that he had a gift that, if he stared into your eyes long enough, he could tell if you were a good person or not. I jokingly asked him what he would have done if his gift had told him I wasn't a good person, and he said, "Oh, well, I probably would have killed you." This may sound like something that would be said by someone that's making a joke or something, but the tone he had sent chills down my spine. I could tell that this man was not joking. He shrugged and then followed up with, "But we don't have to worry about that because you're pure. I can tell you won't be a problem for me." After this night, he came in several times over a few months, and for the most part, the conversations were normal. Well, as normal as they could be with him. He would talk about his job as a janitor, though he wouldn't tell me where he worked, and said it was top secret. He told me about his friends that he went to Iraq with. He would tell me about the ones that didn't make it back. Every once in a while, the short conversations would be broken by him making a really hard grimace and looking away, which told me that he had some internal issues that he was facing. Because of this, I was always polite to him, and I made it a point to keep the conversations as light as I could. There was one night where he came into the store in his underwear and paid in cash. You can guess where he was keeping it. Honestly, that was the night that I almost checked out of this whole thing, but he was incredibly apologetic, and he told me that he forgot his pants. That's it. He had apparently simply forgotten to put pants on. Like I said, it was weird, but I let it go and we moved forward. The aforementioned event that this story is actually about took place around 6 months into Daryl being a regular, almost every other day kind of customer. He and I had built quite the rapport. Hell, after the underwear thing, I would say that we were almost friends even. He had told me all about his time in the military. He had mentioned a few crazy things that he was researching, and he had even told me that he had a son somewhere out there that he hadn't seen for nearly a decade. One night in the fall, probably sometime around October or November, he came into the store and he had a look about him that I hadn't seen before. When I noticed that he seemed off, I said, "Hey, Daryl, you okay, buddy? You aren't looking too good." As soon as I asked him this, his face turned beet red, and he grabbed one of the bottles off the shelf and chucked it straight at me. It hit the shelf and shattered, knocking several things down in the process. At that moment, I was seriously confused and scared. This guy had always seemed a bit out there, but this level of violence wasn't like him. I was standing in the corner, petrified, and trying to process what exactly was happening. And Daryl was standing near the shelf, smashing bottle after bottle and screaming about something that honestly made no sense. He was screaming about how everything in his life was going to hell, about how everyone that he knew was out to kill him. He started listing off what I'm assuming were events of things going wrong in his life. Then he started screaming at me and asking if I was in on it. He was adamant that someone out there was trying to, quote unquote, ruin everything in his life that he had worked so hard for. So at this point, it's 11 at night in this small town. I'm standing behind the counter with my back against the wall and my shoes covered in liquor and shards of glass. There were no other customers in the store. There were no other employees there to help me, as I was the only closer. All the while, this guy that I was sort of acquainted with from his times buying alcohol at our store was shouting every kind of violent profanity at me, and was starting to convince himself that, for some reason, I was one of the bad guys out to get him. He starts in on how the government has been trying to find him, and that the only person he talks to is me. So the fact that they found him meant I was the one telling them information. Obviously, I had no clue what the hell he was going on about, but I was scared. I wasn't sure how far he was going to take it. Thankfully, while I was paralyzed, the owner of the neighboring gas station had apparently called the police. I guess he heard the screaming and the glass shattering because after about 5 minutes of enduring the insanity that was unraveling before me, I heard the door opening and the sound of an officer screaming, "Get on the ground." Daryl actually started to turn his anger toward them for a moment, but I think the weight of the situation may have dawned on him, or he came back to reality, because he started sobbing and quickly got on the ground. After the insanity finally came to an end, the owner of the store showed up and asked me, alongside the police, what happened. I told them I didn't know. I told them everything I knew about Daryl, and that he just showed up enraged and started trashing the store. I felt bad, honestly. It was midnight, and this poor guy had clearly had an episode. After all was said and done, I found out that Daryl actually did have a few mental issues, and he was apparently off his meds for a while. On top of that, he wasn't supposed to be drinking while taking his medication, so it was a recipe for something to go wrong. Like I said though, he was fairly normal for most of our interactions, but this one night he had apparently snapped, and I had just said the wrong thing to him. My manager and I talked about the situation, and he decided to not press charges against Daryl so long as he could pay for what it was destroyed. I actually pitched in for half of it. I think it was something like $150. Sadly, Daryl only came in one more time, and he actually did so to apologize to me personally. He said that he has issues and that he didn't mean to scare me. I told him that I understood, shook his hand, and that was the last time he and I ever interacted. I personally just hope he's doing all right. When I was a kid, there were a group of us kids that pretty much spent every day of our childhood together. For the most part, it was myself, Chuck, and Billy, and the three of us were like brothers. We did everything together, camped in each other's backyards, and spent way too many hours of our days off together. Billy ended up moving away sophomore year, but beyond that, we literally grew up together from elementary school through the years we all graduated, and Billy actually came back home so we could all have a party when he and Chuck finished high school. My point with that is that we were inseparable best friends, and we are still in touch with each other. Now, while the three of us were obviously really close, there was a fourth person in our group for a while, and that was a little girl named Katie. Katie had lived on our block for a few years before we met, and the whole time I knew her, it was just her and her dad that lived at the house. He was a single parent, and none of us had met her mother. Katie was my age, so a year older than the other two, and she was nothing short of a bit strange. Though we did end up figuring out why when all was said and done. And nowadays, I actually feel bad for how we treated her for being weird. I met Katie when I was around 8. She was, to the best of my knowledge, the only girl in the neighborhood that was in our age range. So when we met, it was pretty obvious that she was going to latch onto our trio. We were 8 and 9-year-old boys, so we were a bit annoyed that there was going to be a girl with us, since we were still at that age where girls were a foreign concept. At first, Katie was fine with the three of us though. She was interested in some of the things we were, and she was willing to play our dumb games. We would sword fight with our toy swords, and she was willing to jump in and take a few hits, and she could actually hold her own. She was interested in animals, so she was willing to help me dig up my yard to look for bugs. Basically, she was one of us, for the most part, except when she wasn't herself. Katie was fine probably 95% of the time, but then sometimes she would just be a bit out there, like she was a completely different person. Those times where she would be different, she would sometimes get violent, angry, or just really, really strange. I know that's vague, and I'm not going to get into all of the instances where things were wrong, but I will explain a few of them. The first event of note was one day when we were at Chuck's house and taking turns playing a game on his Super Nintendo. This was typically something we did once a week. We weren't allowed to stay cooped up in the house every day, so it was always super exciting for all of us. I think we were playing one of the Mario games. I'm not sure which one, and it was Katie's turn. Katie wasn't great at the game, but she usually took her losses with grace and laughed about it each time she messed up. Not this time. This time she was playing and she misjudged a jump and ended up dying. Obviously, when this happened, we all chuckled as we did when one of us made a mistake and died. But she didn't. She had a flat stare as she stood up. And by the time the game took us back to the level select screen, Katie had literally jumped up and stomped down on the Nintendo. She smashed it with all of her body weight. And while the console was mostly okay, they actually built those things with this possibility in mind, something I learned later in life, the game ended up bending and snapping in half. Obviously, we all freaked out, and Chuck started bawling. This Super Nintendo was his pride and joy. Katie then looked over at Chuck and put her hands around his throat, literally choking him. And she was telling him to stop crying, that he needed to grow up, that he wasn't a baby, and that if he wanted to cry, she would give him something to cry about. Billy and I jumped into action and pulled her away from Chuck, leaving this whole situation a confusing disaster, and Chuck sitting there looking horrified. Chuck's dad came in to figure out what happened, and we had to explain to him what Katie had done. Strangely enough, Katie actually agreed with our statements, and she was willing to own what happened. She said she was angry, that she wanted to destroy it, so she did. She said that Chuck was crying over nothing, and that he needed to grow up. I honestly don't know what really happened after that, because Chuck's dad told us to go home, but I do know that Katie's dad brought him a new game, and Katie wasn't really allowed at Chuck's house anymore after that happened. In fact, I don't think Chuck and Katie really spent any time together after this, for good reason. I don't want to really get into all the events that Katie caused, because the story could go on for ages, but I do want to go over one of the last things that ended up happening. The thing that I think may have actually caused Katie to be a bit odd. This was around a year after the whole thing with Chuck happened. I was on my own that day and went out into the woods that were behind our neighborhood. I was out there pretending I was some kind of adventurer, when who else would I see but Katie? I went over to talk to her, but as I approached, I noticed something weird. Katie was sitting on the ground, her back against the tree, and was eating a sandwich, while just talking to no one in particular. I walked up to her to ask who she was talking to, and when she noticed me, she jumped and screamed that I shouldn't be there. I was obviously taken aback and scared, and I asked what I had done wrong. She then started going on about how I was upsetting her mother, how she was having dinner with her and I wasn't invited. I kind of just looked around and mentioned that she was alone, that her mom wasn't there. She flipped out. She started screaming at me aggressively that her mother lived in the woods, that I wasn't allowed to be anywhere near her mother, and that I needed to go home before she hurt me. Again, I was confused, but I just said I was sorry and that I didn't know. Strangely enough, Katie shifted from psychotic and ready to pounce to almost sympathetic. She said it was okay, that if I was really sorry, that she wouldn't be mad at me anymore, and that I was welcome to sit with them. I hesitantly agreed with her, mostly because I will admit that at that time in our relationship, I actually did have a crush on her. So sitting with her was something I was more than willing to do. Yes, I had a crush on Katie in spite of her random strange behavior. I sat at one of the trees and just watched her eat her sandwich and talk. She was talking about school, about all the things that she was going through, and what she was going to be doing that week. She was talking to no one in particular, like she was basically telling her mother about her life. I was a bit curious, so I waited for an opening and actually asked her where her mother was. This is where things turned to haunting. Katie looked at me and started crying, like full-on sobbing. I kind of freaked out. I didn't mean to make her cry, so I scooted over to her and gave her a hug and asked her what was wrong. Katie then pulled away and told me that her mother lived in the woods because one night she and her father got into an argument and her dad hurt her. I will say that we were 10, so this was a whole new thing to me. My parents were always happily married, so I didn't understand the situation of my dad hurt my mom. That idea was impossible to me. I asked her how he hurt her, why he hurt her, and so forth. basically interrogating this poor crying girl. And she stopped crying, pulled away from me, and she told me something that made my blood run cold. She looked me in the eyes and said, "My mom's not really living out here. She's dead. My dad killed her. He killed her and buried her out here in the woods. I saw him do it. He doesn't know that I saw it, though. He doesn't know that I know what he did. He doesn't know that I watched him choke her until she died. He doesn't know that I watched him dig the hole and bury her. I watched him do it." She kind of started just rambling all of this and shifting between crying and not crying, and looking back, she was clearly traumatized. I honestly think that this is what caused her to be strange and aggressive. She saw this horrifying event and didn't know how to process it. Of course, I told my parents what she said. Being my age, I didn't know what else to do, but I told them what she said to me. Of course, my parents called the cops, and they reported what Katie had said, and all of it was this huge mess. The cops ended up doing an investigation, talking with Katie about everything, taking reports from her and her father, asking me about everything. And then they did the excavation. This is where things went from weird to absolutely devastating. They dug up the spot in the woods, and they actually did find the body of a woman. Katie wasn't lying or making any of it up. Her dad had actually killed her mother, and he actually did bury her in the woods, which tells me that she really did watch this all play out. To wrap this up, Katie ended up leaving town to live with someone else in her family. Her father was arrested, and all of this was my fault, because she trusted me and I told my parents. Obviously, I know I did the right thing. Her mother deserved justice, and looking back at it as an adult, not telling anyone would have been the worst thing to do. That said, I will never let go of the fact that I changed a huge portion of her life. She was a weird girl, but she was my friend, and I did like her. And because I told my parents what she told me, her whole life changed direction. And I never saw her again. And that day where she told me about what happened was the last time we ever spoke. I never got to say goodbye or anything. I do hope that her life went back to normal after this, as normal as it could be. I hope that she found peace because she deserved it, and I hope that someday she and I can talk again, so I can tell her that I am sorry for all she went through. Katie, if you ever read or hear this story, please know that I've never forgotten you, and I mention your name every single time that I pray. In my 45 years on this earth, I've kind of been everywhere throughout the continental US. Most people would refer to me as a drifter. I like to look at myself as more of an adventurer. I never locked myself down to one place, and I've always lived my life to the fullest extent that I could while enjoying the sights and scenery that most people ignore. I know that most people don't have the ability to do what I do with my time, but I have enough money to live, and I seriously enjoy not being chained to any one location. I've hiked and backpacked and camped pretty much in every state, but I'm partial to the West Coast more than anything. It has some of the most beautiful, untouched wilderness that's out there. I've spent some of my favorite nights camping in woods up near Montana all by myself. That said, if you spend enough time in the woods by yourself, you are absolutely bound to find something weird. There was one trip in particular that sticks out in my mind that is worth talking about. On one of my camping trips, I found a perfect area of woods that was comfortable and empty. Well, I thought it was empty until I got about a quarter or a half mile into the woods and found what appeared to be an abandoned community. That may not be the right word, but by it I mean that there were small houses just outside the tree line in a completely secluded and surrounded area. This was a place that houses seriously had no business being, yet here they were. I admit that I checked out the small community, and again, I'm only using that word because I cannot think of a better way to describe it. It was a town or a village. It was just 4 houses that looked old as hell and run down, sitting inside of a forest clearing. Behind one of those houses was a small playground that looked legitimately run down, like there hadn't been a child to play on the equipment in a couple decades. The climbing equipment and monkey bars were nothing more now than a tetanus nightmare. The merry-go-round thing, or whatever you call it, did not go round whatsoever. The center part of it was completely rusted and seized in place. There were a handful of toys that were strewn around the playground area, but they were all broken or sun-bleached. At this point, I had decided in my mind that this place was likely sufficiently abandoned, and I went to check out one of the houses next. I went to the house next door and peered in through the back door window. Despite the window being dirty and there being a curtain, I could see that there was in fact still furniture in the house. I could see part of the living room, and from where I was, there was a chair, an old couch, and a CRT television that was sitting in the corner of the room. Then I did the illegal thing that I probably shouldn't have, and I broke into the house. I say broke in, but I just more so walked in. The back door was unlocked. The first room in the door was what appeared to be a mudroom with a washer and dryer in it. There was a box of detergent sitting on the washer and some dryer sheets on the drying, but nothing too crazy in this room. Then I walked into the kitchen area where the door led, and honestly, that's where it got strange. The cabinets were all closed, but as I opened them, they were full. There was a pantry that was filled with old-looking canned foods. There were dishes in the strainer next to the sink, but none in the sink. There was a dining room table that had places set with a vase that had plastic flowers in the middle. Nothing about it screamed abandoned, other than the significant layer of dust on everything. I pushed on into the house, and it all just got weirder by the room. There were pictures on the walls, photos of what looked like paintings on canvas that looked like they were hand done. The bedrooms all had beds that were made, and there were clothes in the dressers. On top of that, there was a laundry basket in the hallway that had clothing in it. Now, I know to some people that this may not sound weird or creepy, but all of the houses in the area were similar to this one in that they were furnished and full of random belongings, but they were also a bit messy and completely coated in dust and dirt. It was completely clear that they were all abandoned. These houses were not in use and hadn't been for quite a long time. The dishes by the sink in the first house tell me that whoever lived here probably left in a hurry or with expectations of coming back. These houses were completely abandoned, and they were abandoned in a hurry. The people that left all of their belongings, food, furniture, etc. I have no idea why they would have done that, and I cannot think of any scenario where someone would have to leave their homes permanently in that state. If anyone has any thoughts, I'm open to hearing them. So thinking back, I actually have a story from back when I was a delivery driver for a certain sandwich shop that pretty much doesn't exist anymore. And while there are certainly people out there that won't think of it as creepy, it was certainly messed up and skeevy. It's one of those stupid memories that you wish you could get out of your head, but will not leave. And when you least expect it, bam, instant revisualization of the situation. And it was not a situation that I want to be reminded of frequently. So, as stated, I worked at a certain sandwich shop that was known for making their sandwiches toasty, as they would put it. Unfortunately, they don't really exist anymore, or at least nowhere near how they used to. I was 18 when I worked there and was basically the second in command to the manager, mostly because I'd been there for 2 years, which made me the longest employee at the time aside from him. Unfortunately, being what was basically the assistant manager meant that when corporate told us we were going to do something experimental, I got put on the lead for it. In this instance, we were told that we were going to start doing delivery during what was essentially the dinner hours. Because of this, we would need a delivery driver, and he intended to hire one, but until then, I had to do the deliveries during my shift, and he was going to do them on the days I was off. I was honestly not happy with this, but since it was so new and wasn't even being advertised yet, it was most likely going to just be people that knew about the location and regulars. Because of that, I was a little more okay with it, but still annoyed. Anyways, after a couple of weeks of doing deliveries, it became pretty clear that the manager wasn't in a rush to hire a real delivery driver. So I was going to be stuck doing it, and I pretty much just accepted that it was my job at that point. And again, most of them were fine. That is, until my manager decided that we didn't have enough deliveries and put flyers on every car in his apartment rental complex and every car in the parking lot of our shared strip mall. Basically, he went hardcore on advertising the deliveries as much as he could, and it resulted in us having more than we could handle, and in places that we'd never gone. This was obviously a mess and really pissed me off, but it's also what led to this delivery that stuck with me. This delivery started just like every other one that I'd gone on, except it was to the rental complex where my manager lived, which was basically the absolute farthest we would go for a delivery. The delivery comes in, I roll my eyes angrily and make the sandwich, then tell the other 2 workers that I would be back within half an hour, and if another delivery called in, to tell them that it would be a while. I get in my car and I drive out to what was probably one of the darkest rental complexes I have literally ever been to. I spend several minutes trying to figure out which townhome this guy lives in, until I manage to spot his number on what is probably the darkest corner of the entire property. To add to this, he didn't have his porch light on, and it didn't look like there were any lights on inside. I hesitantly park my car in front of his building and just sit there staring. The main thought going through my mind being that I was about to be robbed. It was way too dark and desolate looking for this to go normal. After a couple seconds, I just sigh and get out of my car, then walk up to his door and knock. After knocking, I turn to look back out into the parking lot to make sure that there's no one sneaking up on me. I just kind of stood there awkwardly and stared off into the nearly empty parking lot for longer than I was comfortable with before knocking again. This time, there was a response to my knocking. I heard a guy's voice say, "Who is it?" To which I said, "I'm with the sandwich place you ordered food for delivery." He then responds asking, "How old are you?" This question was weird. I just responded that I was there to deliver his food, and that was all. He pushed again and asked if I was over 18. I really wanted out of the situation, so I just said yes, hoping he would move on. Then he responds with, "Oh, come on in then. which is not something I expected, nor wanted to hear. I politely informed him that I just needed him to take the order since he had already paid for it and I would be good to go. He then again says that I should just come on in so he didn't have to get up. It was at this point that I was legitimately livid. I wasn't going to risk my life and blindly walk into someone else's house just so this guy could be lazy and not get off his ass for his damn sandwich. I responded as firmly as I could without being rude that I could not enter his home and that I needed to get back to the store. Then said that if he didn't want to get up, I could leave the bag on the porch for him to get at his leisure, but I would not be entering his home. Within a second of me saying this, the door opens and it got worse. The guy that answered was standing there and staring at me with a big grin on his face, and was completely naked, wearing nothing but a baseball cap and his socks. Obviously, I jumped. I didn't expect to see some dude in the buff come to the door for his sandwich, much less one with such a creepy stare on his face. I turned to look away and pushed his food forward for him to just take it so we could end the ordeal as quickly as possible. This guy then reaches out and seriously caresses my hand with his, then says, "Oh, come on, no need to be shy. You sure you don't want to come in?" I seriously almost puked as soon as he said this. I more or less shoved the bag at him and turned, making a mad dash to my car. When I started my car and my headlights kicked on, all I could see was him in all his horrifying glory, standing in the door frame and laughing at me. I pulled out and drove back to the store as quickly as I could. As I was driving, it hit me even harder about how pushy he was for me to come inside. The whole thing just made my skin crawl. When I got back to the store, I called my manager and informed him of the situation, expecting him to be livid that this happened. Much more so for the fact that this guy was practically his neighbor. Much to my surprise, I got nothing more than, "Well, if he didn't hurt you, then we can't do anything about it." I then asked that he be blacklisted from the deliveries, seeing as how he pretty much attempted to do something, and if nothing else, this was indecent exposure. To that, he said, "I can't really blacklist him, so just be more careful next time." And as soon as he told me that I needed to be more careful, I told him to find another assistant manager and that I quit. I hung up, put my hat, apron, and store keys on the desk in the back, and left. I only went back to get my last check, and I didn't even say anything extra to the manager. I was genuinely disgusted that this happened, and also angry and hurt that my manager didn't seem to care. It just pains me to think that if I were a little more naive, a year younger, maybe a bit less observant of the surroundings, I may have thought that it was okay to go into this guy's house, and who knows what would have happened to me. All right, friends, so that was another true story collection. And some of those were pretty heavy, but also the unexplained ones, like the house, was pretty unsettling to me. I'm very curious as to why they were left in such a rush, and also wouldn't make me want to stick around very long. Like something in the area. I don't know. Anyways, if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts. How are you guys surviving this heat? Do you enjoy it? Because we are about to hit the triple digits this week, and I am not happy. I do not like this heat. Please help. And anyways, with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic week. And until next time, take care.